They said I'd never belong. I stood at the gate of their family mansion, drenched in rain, holding the deed with trembling fingers. 1 year ago, they screamed across the dinner table that I was a mistake, a gold digger, a shadow in their perfect legacy. I said nothing then. I just smiled and passed the salt. What they didn't know was I had already started building the plan that would dismantle everything they thought was untouchable. Tonight, I'm not knocking. I own the door. And this story, it doesn't end with revenge. It begins with power. When I first walked into the Carlton mansion as a newlywed, I thought I had stumbled into a fairy tale. The walls were dressed in oil paintings older than my hometown. The chandeliers sparkled like frozen constellations. And the dining table could seat 20 but was set with such precision it felt more like a museum than a home. Everyone smiled, everyone toasted, and everyone watched me like a glass about to crack. "You look radiant," my mother-in-law Sylvia said, pressing air kisses to my cheek. Her voice was velvet wrapped around ice. Daniel always had a soft spot for strays. I laughed, lightly, as if I didn't hear the subtext. I had learned early, survival in elite families wasn't about confrontation. It was about restraint, like passing the salt while they slowly cut you open with polished silver. The days blurred into a perfect, curated monotony. Morning coffee served by staff before I even touched the kitchen. Weekly brunches with the women of the family where conversation was a performance, and my every sentence was weighed like gold. Daniel, my husband, was sweet but distracted, buried in work, always flying between board meetings and investor dinners. I told myself he was just stressed, that love was patient, that I had chosen this life. It wasn't until the 4th week that I noticed the photo frame. It was our wedding photo, me in a lace gown, Daniel with that crooked Carlton smile. But it hung slightly tilted in the main hallway, not enough to be obvious, just enough to be wrong. I reached to straighten it. "Don't," Sylvia's voice came sharp from behind me. "That frame's been there for years. Tradition." Tradition. The word stung. I began to notice other things. At family dinners, no one ever called me daughter-in-law. I was Daniel's wife, or the one he brought from Chicago. My birthday passed unacknowledged. I overheard a cousin asking if I signed a prenup. The staff avoided my eyes. Once during brunch, Sylvia recounted Daniel's childhood to the entire table. And I always said he'd marry someone strong, someone who could carry the Carlton name. Then she looked directly at her daughter, Caroline. Someone born to it. I smiled. I poured tea. I didn't flinch. But inside, something curdled. That night, I stayed up late scrolling through the mansion's internal security system. Daniel had given me access when we moved in. "For safety," he said. But I began to notice something odd. Cameras in strange places. One in the hallway near our bedroom. One pointed directly at the office where I took my Zoom calls. I checked the logs. These weren't just security feeds. They were being accessed regularly, remotely, by someone other than me. Sylvia. The realization chilled me deeper than any insult. She wasn't just judging me. She was watching me, tracking me. Every move, every silence, every sigh recorded. The next morning, Daniel came in holding a printout. "Hey," he said, half sheepish. "Mom thought your Amazon purchases were excessive. Maybe slow down?" I stared at him. How would she know what I ordered? He blinked. I don't know. Of course he didn't. He never asked. He never saw it. The surveillance, the erasure, the way Sylvia slowly turned me into a ghost inside my own home. It all came to a head at the gala. The Carltons hosted a fundraiser every year. Politicians, CEOs, celebrities, all gathered under the crystal chandeliers to sip vintage champagne and pretend to care. I stood beside Daniel in a red silk dress, smiling, poised. Sylvia took the microphone. Her voice boomed with practiced elegance. As you all know, the Carlton legacy is one built by vision, discipline, and bloodline. And I'm proud to announce that my daughter, Caroline, will be stepping into the family business as our new vice president. Applause erupted. Not a word about Daniel. Word. Not a mention of me. I smiled, I clapped, I toasted with the rest. But inside, something broke with surgical precision. Not anger, not even hurt, just clarity, a cold, crystallized understanding. I was not welcome. I was not family. I was not meant to succeed here. And so, the next morning, while Sylvia sipped her imported tea and discussed hedge funds with her private banker, I quietly installed spyware into her phone, a keystroke logger, disguised as a calendar app, because I had learned something far more useful than etiquette. Power doesn't announce itself. It listens. Then it prepares. I started crying at breakfast. Subtle tears. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to make Daniel stop mid-bite, fork hovering, concern creasing his brow. "Emily, what's going on?" "I don't know," I whispered. I feel lost lately. Maybe we should think about having a baby. It might help." His shoulders stiffened. The perfect Carlton poker face passed down like a genetic heirloom. "Now's not a great time," he mumbled, "with everything at work." "Of course," I nodded, folding into the role I needed him to believe. The emotionally fragile wife, searching for purpose, desperate for love, harmless. It was easier to play weak than to explain I was already building something far more enduring than motherhood. That afternoon, I took my laptop to the guest house. It had its own Wi-Fi network, separate from the main house, and a locked door no one cared about. In that quiet sanctuary, I finished registering a company in the Bahamas under a false name. Not an illegal move, just invisible. Anonymous shell companies were the currency of the elite. The difference was, mine had a purpose. The Carlton Group operated like many old money dynasties, bloated, inefficient, and so arrogant they believed no one could outmaneuver them. They owned shares in dozens of subsidiary companies, real estate, energy, tech startups, but rarely paid attention to the ones that seemed too small or too foreign. That's where I started. I contacted brokers quietly, offshore, through encrypted servers. I acquired minority stakes, then converted those into shell company holdings that traced back to no one. They thought they were selling to investors in Dubai, Singapore, maybe even pension funds. They were selling to me. It took months. I wore my depression like perfume, whispering to Sylvia that I felt unworthy, staying in bed until noon, taking long walks alone to clear my mind. In reality, I was working harder than I ever had in my life, studying board reports, mapping ownership structures, identifying weaknesses. And that's when I found the lawyer. His name was Mark Gallen, a high-end mergers and acquisitions attorney with a reputation for discretion and loyalty to the Carltons. But Mark had debts, gambling mostly, and a mistress in Barcelona. I knew because I found his private browser history while monitoring Sylvia's encrypted texts. One discreet offer, double his Carlton retainer, and suddenly, Mark was mine. He didn't just share intel, he drafted papers, he altered phrasing, he helped me push the dominoes just close enough to tip. At brunch one Sunday, Sylvia looked over her mimosa and said, "Daniel tells me you've been feeling, unwell." I nodded. "It's just hormones, maybe. I've been thinking. Therapy, acupuncture, maybe even IVF. Anything to make things feel more stable." Her smile tightened. "Just remember, dear, Carltons are born, not made." I smiled back. Of course. That same week, whispers began to circulate in industry circles. The Carlton Group was overextended. Quiet losses, poor debt structure, a few missed payments. None of it was true, yet. But perception had always been more powerful than fact. Then came the offer. A new investment fund, Echelon Strategic Holdings, offered to buy the Carlton Group's downtown office tower. A premium price, fast closing, all cash. Sylvia and Daniel debated for days. The board leaned yes. It was only one building after all. They had 6 more. They signed the deal. And I, through a series of proxy entities, became the legal owner of the building where Sylvia first told me, This place isn't for you." The morning after the transfer, Daniel mentioned it offhand. "Did you hear about the Echelon deal?" he asked, sipping coffee. "Mom said it's a sign the market trusts us again." I nodded. "That's great." He didn't know that I now controlled the lease agreements for 5 Carlton affiliate companies operating out of that tower. 1 missed payment, 1 late filing, and I could evict them, legally, quietly, efficiently. The next week, Sylvia threw a party to celebrate their financial repositioning. Guests asked about the Echelon Group. She bragged about her foresight, her brilliance, her legacy. I watched from the stairs, champagne in hand, unnoticed. Just another shadow in silk. She toasted the future. I already owned her past, and her present, and soon, her entire illusion of control. Because when the next deal came, a rescue offer for a floundering Carlton Tech subsidiary, Sylvia would leap. And again, Echelon would be waiting. They still hadn't figured it out. I was no longer their daughter-in-law. I was their creditor. And creditors get paid in blood. I left my phone unlocked on the kitchen counter, just long enough for Daniel to see the text. "I missed last night already," it read. "Next time, don't leave a bruise." He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, eyes scanning the screen, shoulders stiffening like concrete poured into bone. When I came back into the room, he barely looked at me. "Who's Owen?" he asked, voice flat. I blinked. "What?" "The guy who misses last night." I stared at him for a moment, then let silence bloom between us. Silence, I had learned, is a weapon far more potent than denial. His imagination would do the rest. He filed for divorce 3 days later. Sylvia's voice trembled with poorly masked triumph when she called. "It's for the best, dear. These things happen, but we'll handle it discreetly. Quiet settlement. No need for messy courtrooms." "No need at all," I agreed sweetly. "I'll sign whatever you need." She was practically giddy. The Carlton family attorneys prepared the divorce settlement with the kind of ruthlessness they usually reserved for hostile takeovers. I waived alimony. I waived property rights. I agreed to walk away with nothing but my clothes. They thought I was finished. They hadn't read the clause buried in the pre-nuptial agreement, the one Daniel insisted on adding himself back when he still loved me. It granted me voting rights to any shares gifted during our marriage, even post-divorce, so long as they remained in my name. He had gifted me 11%, and thanks to my quiet acquisition of offshore holdings, I now held another 50%. I walked out of that house with no jewelry, no car, no husband, but I walked out owning 61% of the Carlton Group. The next board meeting was scheduled 3 weeks later. Routine, quarterly, nothing special. Sylvia and Caroline prepared to dazzle the room with their vision for the next generation. They didn't notice the new name on the attendance list. When I walked in, dressed in navy silk and sharper than I'd ever looked, the room fell into a hush, like a curtain drop in an opera house. Caroline stammered, This is a closed meeting." I smiled, "Not for majority shareholders." The chairman glanced at the documents my lawyer had distributed minutes before. His face went pale. Sylvia's voice cut the silence like a blade. "This is absurd. You're no longer part of this family." "Correct," I said. "I'm part of the company, and unfortunately for you, I outrank you now." Murmurs erupted around the table. I waited. Then I moved to my first agenda item. "Financial discrepancies," I said, sliding a thick folder across the table toward the audit committee. "Specifically those tied to the marketing department. Falsified reports, inflated valuations, all traced back to one person." I turned my gaze to Caroline. "You're suggesting," she began. "I'm not suggesting anything. The evidence is conclusive. You forged quarterly reports to secure investment that never existed. That's fraud." "No one will believe you," she hissed. I smiled. "They already have. Check your email." Phones lit up, heads bowed, gasps. Caroline's face drained of color. "I move to terminate Caroline Carlton effective immediately," I said. "All in favor?" Hands rose like a tide. Sylvia stood. "This is a farce. You don't belong here." "I belong wherever the shares say I do." "You manipulative little—" "You taught me," I interrupted quietly. "All I did was pay attention." Her face twisted, anger, disbelief, and something else. Grief, maybe. She stumbled back into her chair. In that moment, I realized something chilling. She wasn't furious because I destroyed her daughter's career or because I exposed her house of cards. She was devastated because she didn't see it coming. For a woman who prided herself on control, that was the deepest wound. I leaned forward. "You didn't just lose your son, Sylvia. You lost your empire. And I didn't have to raise my voice once." The board sat in stunned silence. I had expected the satisfaction to feel louder, but it didn't. It felt surgical, sterile, complete. I gathered my notes, nodded to the chairman, and walked out. Behind me, the empire she built on exclusion and pride began to crack, quietly, efficiently, irreversibly. And I didn't need revenge. I had ownership. I didn't celebrate. No champagne, no victory dance, no smug smile in the mirror. Instead, I drove 3 hours north to a modest grave under an oak tree with no headstone, only a brass plaque embedded in the earth. Claire Monroe, 1967 to 2001, beloved mother. I stood there for a long time, letting the cold wind cut through my coat like a quiet punishment. She had died of a stroke, they said, but the truth was always more complicated. She lost her job after the bank she worked for was acquired, then restructured, then dissolved. And with it, her pension, her dignity, her will to fight. I was 16. That bank had been a subsidiary of Carlton Finance Group. Back then, I didn't know what those words meant, but now I knew too well. The destruction they caused wasn't always loud. Sometimes it looked like a single mother quietly skipping meals so her daughter could eat. Sometimes it looked like a woman dying quietly in a small apartment no one cared to visit. I walked away from the grave with a new plan. Revenge wasn't enough. It was too small, too self-contained. I wanted obliteration, but I also wanted something to rise from the ashes. The Claire Monroe Foundation launched 2 months later, offering full-ride scholarships to young women whose families had been destroyed by predatory lending, foreclosures, or bankruptcy. No GPA requirement, no essay, just a story. I read every application myself, every line, every tear-stained paragraph. It broke me and remade me all at once. The board asked questions, of course. "Is this personal?" one investor said. "All business is personal," I replied. At the same time, I commissioned an external audit of the Carlton Group, not internal, not domestic, international, forensic, and deeply uncomfortable. It took 6 weeks. What they found wasn't surprising, at least not to me. Offshore transfers, missing funds, overstated earnings, thinly veiled money laundering operations routed through 3 shell companies, 2 of which were barely disguised charities. It was all packaged in a neat, damning report. I didn't leak it. I simply left it where someone would find it. On the desk of a journalist I used to date, back when I believed in clean breakups and honest journalism. He didn't call to ask permission. The article dropped on a Monday morning. By noon, the Carlton stock had dropped 38%. By Wednesday, it was 70%. The board panicked. Investors pulled out. Asset freezes loomed. Sylvia's silence was the loudest scream in the room. She hadn't made a public statement in days. Her PR team begged for a response. She refused because she knew. She knew it wasn't random. It wasn't bad luck. It was precision, controlled demolition. On Friday, I returned to the mansion. It looked smaller than I remembered. The ivy was dying on the stone walls. The windows needed washing. And the gate creaked as it opened for me. My name on the deed, notarized and stamped. Daniel wasn't there. Neither was Sylvia. The staff had long since been dismissed. I walked through the grand foyer, past the tilted photo still hanging in the hallway. I didn't fix it. I walked into the sitting room where Sylvia once hosted her afternoon teas and placed a single envelope on the table. Inside was the final document, the transfer of full ownership of the property. The check used for the purchase had cleared that morning. Funds routed through Carlton's last remaining offshore account. I bought their legacy with the money they laundered to protect it. I stood in that room, alone, and let the silence swallow me whole. I'm not just the end of your story, I whispered into the walls. I'm the beginning of everyone you tried to erase. Outside, a delivery truck pulled up with the new brass plaque, Claire Monroe Women's Leadership Center, opening next spring. A place for women who were never given a seat at the table, to build their own. A second life for a house that once tried to silence me. They called me garbage. And now they lived in the mess I swept into power. They called me the Widow of Wall Street. Anonymous forums, finance blogs, late-night pundits, everyone had a nickname. Some said I was a genius, others a virus. The woman who brought down her own family to gain control. The Avenger in heels, the monster in silk. I read every headline, every comment. I didn't flinch. Power was never about applause. It was about holding the microphone when the room went silent. But silence comes with echoes. The night after the Claire Monroe Center opened, I found an email from Daniel sitting in my inbox. No subject line, just a single sentence in the body. You won, Emily, but you lost me. I stared at it for a long time, not because I missed him, I didn't, but because I finally realized he had never once said, I'm sorry. Not for the cameras, not for the silence, not for the loyalty he gifted to his mother at the cost of his wife. I typed a reply. I never lost you, because I never had you. I didn't press send. Some truths don't need to be delivered. They just need to be understood. Weeks passed. I flew to Geneva for a keynote on ethical restructuring. I smiled in photos with women in business suits who whispered that I was an icon. I returned to New York to ribbon cut another community center, posed for the press, and left without staying for wine. And yet something felt off. Mark, my lawyer, had stopped answering calls directly. His emails were vague, colder. I chalked it up to workload. But then came the shareholder meeting. It was scheduled like any other quarterly. But when I logged into the virtual conference, I noticed something strange. My access code had expired. I called the Carlton Group's general counsel. She apologized profusely. It must be a system error, she said. I'll fix it right away. But the code never came. The following day, I received a formal letter from the board. Your voting rights have been suspended pending a review of conflict of interest concerns, it read. I blinked, rereading the line, then again, and then I understood. I called Mark, straight to voicemail. I drove to his office. The receptionist smiled nervously. He's not available. He's on extended leave. Where? I'm not allowed to say. I went home, opened the encrypted archives, and started digging. 3 hours later, I found it. A clause. One I had never seen before. Buried in a supplemental filing Mark had prepared 6 months prior, during the chaos when things were moving fast, and I had trusted him. It restructured the corporate voting rights of the offshore shells I used to consolidate my majority. On the surface, nothing changed. But in execution, it transferred proxy authority to a trustee board, 3 members, one of whom was Mark Gallen. The others, executives from a multinational investment conglomerate, Orthus Capital. I'd heard the name before. A shadowy megafirm with hands in real estate, media, defense, and now, Carlton. They'd been circling for years, waiting for the old dynasty to fall apart. I had just saved them the trouble. I wasn't the hunter anymore. I was the bait. Mark hadn't betrayed me overnight. He had played a longer game, one I never suspected because I thought the enemy was obvious. A mother-in-law, a husband, a family, not the man who handed me the scalpel. I sat in my office, lights off, screen glowing, documents open like open wounds. I had built the bomb, I had lit the fuse, but someone else cashed in on the explosion. The following week, Orthus announced a strategic acquisition of Carlton assets. No mention of me, no statement from the foundation, just clean corporate language. I didn't fight it, not publicly. The cost of fighting would have been higher than the company was worth. Instead, I watched from the sidelines as they devoured what remained of the empire I had stolen. I was the woman who took down a dynasty. But in the end, I wasn't the one who replaced it. I was just the storm, the harbinger, a temporary instrument for permanent change. And that night, for the first time since I left the mansion, I cried. Not because I lost, but because I had become what I once hated most: necessary, disposable, and already replaced. The ocean looked different when you had nothing to prove to it. I rented a small cottage on the edge of a sleepy coastal town where the internet was slow. The air was clean, and no one cared about stock prices or mergers. The locals didn't know my name, and I didn't offer it. They just called me the lady who teaches money stuff. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I walked to the old library with a thermos of tea and a stack of handouts. The community room smelled like old books and pencil shavings. My students were women who had never balanced a budget, who had been left with nothing after divorce, bankruptcy, or betrayal. They came with shame in their eyes and fire in their voices. I showed them how to open accounts, how to track spending, how to ask questions that made bankers nervous. We didn't talk about power in boardrooms. We talked about rent, child support, credit cards, survival, and then something more than survival. I watched them transform slowly. One began selling handmade soaps online. Another went back to school for accounting. One left her abusive partner after realizing she could finally afford her own apartment. I didn't feel like a warrior anymore. I felt like a gardener. During those months, I wrote. The words came slow at first, reluctant, jagged, but they came, not as a memoir. I had no interest in becoming a spectacle. It was more like a blueprint, a guide for how to break cycles without breaking people. I called it How to Be Unbreakable Without Breaking Others. The manuscript was raw, part strategy, part confession. I talked about my mother, about the hunger of ambition, about how easy it was to confuse justice with revenge, and about how, sometimes, the cost of power wasn't worth the currency of your soul. I self-published. The book took off like wildfire, not because I promoted it, but because the world was full of people who had quietly survived things they never had the language to explain. And I had given them words, not victory, but vocabulary. The media wanted interviews, podcasts, panels. I said no to all of it. Fame, I had learned, was just another kind of prison, one where the locks were made of applause. Then, one morning, I got a letter, not an email, a handwritten letter addressed to Emily Monroe. The return address was the Claire Monroe Women's Leadership Center, formerly known as the Carlton Mansion. I hadn't stepped foot inside it since the transfer. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. It was from a 22-year-old named Lila. She had grown up watching her mother work 3 jobs after a divorce, left them with nothing. She was now living in one of the scholarship apartments in the mansion, studying computer science and trying to build a startup to help women learn to code. She wrote, I don't want to fix the system. I want to build a new one. I folded the letter and bought a train ticket the same day. The mansion was unrecognizable. The cold marble floors were now covered in woven rugs. The chandeliers still sparkled, but with warmth instead of intimidation. In the main hall, where portraits of Carlton men once loomed, there was now a mural, women of all shades and shapes, climbing ladders, holding hands, planting seeds. It didn't feel like mine. It didn't need to. I found Lila in what used to be Sylvia's solarium. She had a laptop open, blueprints spread across the table, and a messy bun holding back ambition. She looked up, froze, then blinked twice. "Wait, are you her?" I smiled. "Depends who you think I am." "You're the woman who bought the house, right? The one who changed everything?" I sat down beside her. "I'm just someone who decided the game wasn't worth playing anymore." She paused, then asked the question I knew was coming. "How did you do it? How do I become like you?" The air stilled. The old me, the version that burned bridges and swallowed boardrooms, would have given her a list, a battle plan, a 5-step strategy, but I'd outgrown that. I looked her in the eye. "Don't become me," I said gently. "Become the version of yourself they can't control, the one they can't predict, the one who doesn't need to burn the world to light her own fire." She exhaled like something in her had just been given permission to exist. Outside the solarium, the laughter of other women echoed in the halls. It was not the sound of vengeance. It was the sound of something better, freedom. I stood up to leave. Lila grabbed my hand. "Thank you," she said. I didn't answer. There are some things that don't need a reply. They just need to be passed on.